Thank you, everyone, for joining us once again for the second year of the Latino Podcast Listener Report. I'm Gabriel Soto from Edison Research.
And I'm Martina Castro, CEO of Adonde Media. I'm so excited to be back for a second year of this study.
Yes, and I'm excited too because we have a lot of great findings that we want to share in this edition. Interesting research that answers many questions like how did podcasts weather the pandemic among Latinos? We covered the incredible upside for listening among this group last year. So we're going to see if it actually grew. And we'll also cover some insights into how Latinos feel about podcast advertising and what's up with video podcasts.
Yeah, that was a big one from last year. If you remember, last year, YouTube was the service that Latinos used most to listen to podcasts. So we'll see if that's the case this time around.
Yes, and we want to say thank you to all the sponsors of the report. Martina, your company, Adonde Media. We also have Lantigua Williams and Company, Libsyn, PRX, Simplecast, Sonoro, and SXM Media. Please, audience, take the time to thank them for making this information available to you and to the rest of the public.
And of course, we want to thank Edison Research for conducting the study. A few members of their team are standing by to answer any questions you might have during this presentation. You might feel like you're getting an overload of data today, which is totally reasonable. Feel free to drop a question in the Q&A window if you're joining us live, and members of the Edison Research team will respond if they can. And if you're joining us after the webinar has been published, you can always email your questions to info@edisonresearch.com.
Yes, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Latino Podcast Listener Report 2021.
Woohoo!
So this year's study was conducted very similar to last year's. We conducted more than 2,500 online interviews of adults in the U.S. who identified as Hispanic or Latino. We fielded the survey in May, just like we did last year. It was also weighted the same way. And a similar percentage of respondents took the survey in Spanish. That's 17%. So this all allows a smooth apples to apples comparison to the report from last year, which you'll see referenced throughout.
We're going to begin by looking at the changes in podcast listening among 6 groups: the total US population, Latinos overall, and also 4 major groups of Latinos based on language use and birthplace, totaling
Yes,
6. Yes.
yes, 6 in total. So all Latinos were presented with a question: which language do you use at home? Here's a breakdown. Combining those two blue sections there, we consider that group the people who said only Spanish or mostly Spanish. That group is considered the Spanish language dominant group. And combining the other sections, the Spanish and English equally, mostly Spanish, or those who only use English at home, we call that group the not Spanish language dominant. These combinations form two of the 6 groups Martina mentioned.
It's so exciting to have data on both of these groups because Spanish language dominant listeners are often overlooked in the US. If you all are up to date with that kind of stuff, we have very, very little data on Spanish language dominant listeners. And you're going to see that these habits of listening really do break down differently among these two groups.
Yes, and here are the other 2 groups. The 66% or more than 2/3 of Latinos who were born in the United States, and the 1/3 of Latinos who were born outside of the United States. If you take a look at that Spanish dominant group and those born outside of the US, uh, there is a bit of overlap, but not everyone in those 2 groups are the same people. They're very similar in size, but they're different. When we take a look at age, you have the Spanish dominant group. They're more likely to be younger than those born outside of the United States. And consider, for example, the people who are born in the U.S. but have parents who they still live with, and therefore that's the reason why they live in Spanish dominant households. That's just one example and of how they're different. But those 2 groups, they'll have very similar listening behaviors, but some areas you'll see a big difference. But that's it. There you have it. We'll be looking at podcast listening among these 4 major groups of Latinos, as well as the U.S. adult population. and the U.S. Latino population overall. So let's start with these big groups. This is the percentage of people who are familiar with the term podcasting. 64% of Latinos said that they're familiar with the term podcasting here in 2021. That's up from 61% last year. For the US total population, that's at 77%. So you can see year over year that awareness, that gap in awareness that we saw between these two groups still exists 1 year later. And why is this the case? Well, awareness among Spanish language dominant and foreign born Latinos didn't increase at all. Um, for that Spanish language dominant group, 47% said they are aware of podcasts. For those born outside of the US, 44% said they are aware of the term podcasting. That's less than half in each group who are familiar with the term. But if you look at their counterparts, the not Spanish dominant group and those born in the US, they're similar to the US total population in terms of awareness. And whenever I look at this data, I think back to our review that we had with Nidia Serrano of Pandora, which is under SXM Media. And we had this discussion of how the term podcasting is derived from English. There's always going to be a language barrier to understand what podcasting actually means, not just for those who speak Spanish, but also everyone else, and globally speaking, internationally for people that don't speak English.
Yeah, I think this is something, Gabe, that we've seen at Adonde Media, and I'm sure all the partners who are working in Spanish language areas or Spanish language audiences have seen for a long time. Podcasting is just, people don't even know how to pronounce it in Spanish. So it's definitely going to take a while. I think, if anything, my sort of finger in the air prediction here is that we're gonna get around this term in not so long, because people are tuning into places like Spotify and they're calling it a show, just like you'd call a TV show a show. And so there's ways that, slowly but surely, the fact that it's a podcast, yes, we hope that the term will continue to gain traction, but we are finding ways to get around it. And I think you're going to see that, happening over the coming years in Spanish language audiences
Mhm.
and foreign born audiences.
Yes, and definitely, it's probably a similar story with other technologies of the past that derived from English words like streaming audio. People are coming to understand and beginning to understand what that actually means. But you're right about that. We didn't want that barrier to be a factor. Um, so take a look at this. What we're going to show everyone next is pretty fascinating. Keep one eye on that 47% among the Spanish dominant group, and another eye on that 44% among those born in the US. We're going to switch our graph here from awareness to the measurement of how many people ever listen to podcasts at one point in their life, and watch what happens. Among the Spanish language dominant group, 59% say they've ever listened to a podcast, and among those born outside of the US, 53% say they've ever listened to a podcast. That's higher than their familiarity, and essentially their listening surpasses awareness of the term. And here's why that is. The way we set up the survey, we ask familiarity first. We ask, are you familiar with the term podcasting? Have you ever heard of it? Um, but even those who say no, we still explain to them the definition and what a podcast actually is, allowing them to answer whether they've actually listened to one or not without knowing what the term actually means. We do this in our infinite dial study. We do this in our other studies that we do internationally. And that's also because we don't want that language barrier to be a factor in measuring this listening.
Yeah, I'm so, so glad that you all included this and worked a way around that term being a limiting factor in people listening. I mean, it's just incredible to me, this data, that just shows people are listening, and even without knowing that they're listening. It's just kind of an amazing, amazing fact.
Mhm. And a couple other things to take away from here. Among Latinos, listening has shot up tremendously. Our key finding here, um, the majority of Latinos in 2021 have tried a podcast at one point in their life. We couldn't say that last year, but because listening has increased, we can now say that this year. A big milestone. It's really worth celebrating. And Martina, I'm going to hold you to this. Last year, if you remember, we looked at that 45% among U.S. Latinos. I told you if we were to get across 50%, that you would have to organize a party.
Oh
Um,
my goodness.
you don't
I
remember
had to
this?
say
I
yes.
have it on video. I have receipts.
I
Um,
guess I guess it is recorded somewhere.
It is publicly, and everyone knows about it. So let us know where the party is. I don't care if I have
Okay.
to come out all the way from
I'll
Miami to
keep you
LA. I'll be there.
posted. I'll keep you posted. It is really something worth celebrating. And also this data, one other thing I want to point out is just that it's really pointing to the fact that I know it's not apples to apples because the data that you have for the US total population is done by a phone study, our reports online, but really you could almost say that Spanish language dominant audiences are surpassing the US total population in ever listening to a podcast. I mean, you know,
Yep.
one could draw that conclusion, and that's staggering. I mean, that's not something I think anyone has in their back pocket as a data point about Spanish language audiences for sure. I mean, I just think it's pointing to the incredible growth that's happening in a sector of the industry where they don't even know what they're listening to, and once they're told, they're like, oh yeah, 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 I have listened to one of those. And so I can't wait for sort of the familiarity with the term, access and all the other things we need for more growth in this sector of the industry to catch up with people's behavior. Because frankly, this data is showing that they're listening faster than we are able to cater to them.
Yep. And that's a something interesting that's it's worthwhile pointing out that the listening gap has narrowed. That wasn't the case last year. That listening gap has narrowed. And it's both English and Spanish podcast listening that's driving this growth. If you look here, less than half of US Latinos have ever listened to a podcast that was mostly in English. That's up from 36% last year. And for Spanish podcasts, 1/3 of US Latinos have ever listened to a podcast that was mostly in Spanish, and that's up from a quarter last year. And listening in both languages has led to growth in Latino monthly podcast listeners. Last year, in May 2020, 1/4 of Latinos said they listened to a podcast in the last month. Since then, that number has soared to 36%, or over 1/3 of all Latinos. And look at this. That's also true for both non-Spanish dominant and Spanish dominant Latinos as well. However, when you look at that section on the far right, we see a difference between US born and foreign born Latinos.
Yeah, and Gabe, that makes sense, obviously, because those born outside of the US are probably the more likely to be Spanish language dominant. And as we just talked about, familiarity with the term podcasting is lower among Spanish language dominant groups. And, clearly those Latinos born in the US are going to be more privy to marketing of podcasts, and podcast listening is just more prevalent here in the US. So having access to that in English and having had longer time here, I think it just makes this data doesn't surprise me at all.
Absolutely. And if everyone can take a look here, podcast listening grew at a faster rate than the total population, and that's 44% among Latinos to be exact, while the US population saw an increase of just 8%. And Martina, we conduct plenty of other podcast studies at Edison, and we've seen this strong growth in our other research. That's why we're comfortable showing this, and we're willing to go out here with this data. Um, Latinos are
It's
just
tremendous. Yeah, I mean,
tremendous.
I'm really just so glad you put this specific percentage in here because, I mean, just look at that rate of growth. I think that, we can no longer, as an industry, ignore US Latinos as a growing sector of listeners in podcasts. I mean, this is it. That 44% number is so stark in comparison with the 8%. I don't thank you for putting that together, because I really
Hmm.
think that that kind of paints a very clear picture
Yeah.
of this of the potential here.
Yep, absolutely. Latinos are joining the party at an incredibly fast rate. Um,
Yeah.
and, and we also quickly want to point out that 29% of Latinos are weekly podcast listeners, because we'll be isolating this group in a bit to draw some important comparisons. And another thing I want to point out here, that 29% is very close to that 36% of monthly listeners, as you previously saw, meaning that the overwhelming majority of monthly listeners also listen weekly. Um, but let's zoom in on those US Latino monthly podcast listeners, or what we estimate to be 16 million Latinos living in the United States. Like last year, these people skew male, and the slight increase to 58% since last year means more Latino men are joining this party that we just talked about at higher rates. But it could also mean Latino women are leaving this group of monthly listeners, which can indicate some turnover.
Yeah, I find this interesting because at Adonde Media, we, on some of actually partners from this study, we fund a collective, a collaborative audience survey called Encuesta Pod. And that is, different set of data. Obviously, we just survey Spanish speaking people from around the world that elect to take the study themselves. It's self selected. So it's not as rigorous in terms of scientific backing, but I do think that it's showing a very similar trend, and it's been for years in Spanish language audiences in Latin America. And so this is consistent with that. And I really interesting to think that maybe it's because women are leaving. I still think that that the shows cater to men, and that they're, we'll dig a little more into the kinds of shows that are popular, but I do think that there are more male producers and more male hosts. So it makes sense that sort of that initial phase and wave of podcast production and podcast creation is coming from men. So that men would be listening, or more men would listen, makes sense to me. And I think we're going to see, at least in Latin America for sure, and I see it happening in the US as well, like just women, Latinas coming to the mic. And I think that is going to really shift things. And hopefully this kind of data will help us figure out what we can do to keep our female identifying listeners tuning
Mhm.
in.
Yeah, and absolutely. It's a good point that you bring up there, that, your Enquestapod results are of Latin America, and building content for US Latinos here. It's not just for these US Latinos, it's a gateway to a global population of those who also might be interested in similar content. Um, so since last year, we've also observed that some slight growth there among those who are 35 to 54. And one thing that I want to point out here is that US Latinos are young to begin with, and young as in compared to the total US population. Um, and it's important to know that Latino podcast listeners are even younger than Latinos overall. And you can see that right there with that 48% of Latinos who identify as being in that 18 to 34-year-old age group. That just represents just under half of all listeners, which is pretty incredible. And just keep that in mind, audience, as you see the rest of the report. This could be a factor of different behaviors and why Latinos can be different than other populations. But if you're interested in the differences of ages, we do really cover this a lot more in detail in last year's report. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. It's free. It's on edisonresearch.com. And here's some more detail on who these US Latino monthly podcast listeners are. 65% say they live in not Spanish language dominant households, while 35% say they live in Spanish language dominant households, and that's a similar distribution to last year. But this year, listeners are more likely to be US born Latinos, the first generation, or those who have at least one immigrant parent, that grows slightly to represent half of all monthly listeners. In the size of those who are born outside of the country, that decreases from 31% to a quarter of all monthly listeners. Martina, you really pointed this out earlier. US born Latinos were bigger drivers in listening growth, and this is just further evidence of that. And another way to look at growth is by asking listeners directly, how long have you been listening? And just about half of all monthly listeners say they started listening within the last year. If you add the listeners in red and blue at the top, that's what you get. Their combined sizes, like last year, is once again larger among the Spanish dominant listeners when compared to their counterparts, the non Spanish dominant group.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by that bigger chunk. Obviously, I produce podcasts in Spanish, and so it's really interesting to me how many of the Spanish how what a large percentage of the Spanish language dominant group has come to the medium in just the last 6 months. I think this is just showing that this sector is still growing, and that the frankly, during the pandemic, it has been a driver, right, for Spanish language dominant groups to come to podcasts.
hmm and yeah, this also, I like to give a shout out to Elsie Escobar of Libsyn, who when I asked her about this, do you really think it's the content that's becoming available? And she said, it's probably content, but it's also the promotion. The fact that these mainstream platforms like Apple, for example, Apple Podcasts for the first time gave the ability to users to look up podcasts in Spanish in 2021. But it's these platforms and these bigger mainstream companies that are amplifying and promoting these podcasts for Spanish language dominant folks. This is happening, like you said, during the pandemic. We put out a lot of data, a lot of info on how podcasting has increased since COVID-19 blindsided the entire world, and we want to do that here too. So here's what we did. Take a look at that group in orange in the top bar. Listeners who started listening 1 to 3 years ago, we asked that 28% if they started listening in March 2020 or after or before, and 1/5 of that group said yes, they started listening in March 2020 or after. That equates to 6% of all Latino podcast listeners. And if you add that together with that 20% in blue and 28% in red, the people who started listening within the last year, you get 54% of US Latino monthly listeners who say they started listening during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, and how does this compare to the general population, Gabe? Do you have that figure handy?
We do have that handy,
Amazing.
and we have it handy because we knew people were going to be skeptical of this. This is such a big estimate, um, and yes, of course, when you're looking at this finding, you'd expect monthly listeners to have doubled among Latinos since the last year's report. It didn't. Remember, it grew from 25% to 36%. But there are a few things to keep in mind here before I show that population number that you asked about, Martina. One, being a monthly listener isn't permanent. It does not mean you'll always be one. You have people that stopped listening and dropped out of this group. So that's, like I said earlier, it could indicate some turnover. Two, remember that last year's report was conducted in May, and that 25% last year had already captured some of that growth that may have occurred in March and April of 2020. But you asked for it, and here it is. This population number that we take from our other study called Share of Year. This is We collect this data by sending out a diary to a nationally representative sample of the US population every quarter. We instruct people to tell us what they listen to throughout the day. And this is the percentage of people that reported listening to a podcast on their diary day. So it serves as a measurement of daily listenership. And at the top in yellow, you have 10% of the entire population reported listening to a podcast before the COVID-19 pandemic in quarter 1 of 2020. Fast forward a year later, and that number grows to 15% in quarter 1 of 2021, or during the pandemic. So if you shift your attention to the group second from the bottom, you can see how that number nearly doubles for Latinos during the same year, which supports our previous finding. Um, Daily podcast listening grew at a faster rate among Latinos compared to any other ethnic group shown here.
That is exactly what I wanted. Thank you so much. A fascinating, fascinating way to look at how the Latino podcast listening group is just outpacing every other group in terms of what happened during the pandemic. Who knows why that happened? But there's some really interesting, like that's just gives you fodder to consider. Okay, we have this audience now. Let's not lose them, right? Like that's something that I can't help but think that by some virtue of what was going on in Latino households, many were turning to podcasts. And now we thankfully have this like huge audience to retain, right? Like just like you said, this is not there's nothing about this that says we're going to keep them as monthly listeners, but that group is now definitely grown and we have an opportunity as creators for sure.
Exactly. And we saw that potential last year, and that's something we emphasize a lot in the 2020 year report. Um, and here it is. It shows that that growth and that potential has been met. Um, and what's very comforting to see, and when you and I both looked at this for the first time, we thought it was super comforting that, at least for now, those who started listening to podcasts during the pandemic, and every listener for that matter, claims that they will continue listening when the pandemic ends. So that's virtually everyone, at 96% there among all monthly listeners, and at 97% there among those who
Yes,
started listening.
I love that you say that it's comforting because yes, it's comforting, but I'm also like, okay, we need to be aware that they're not just going to listen because they plan on listening. They're going to listen if we keep on giving them good content to retain them. So I think of it as like a warning sign. It's like, oh yeah, I'll keep listening if you keep giving me some good stuff to listen to. So let's just not get lazy is my thought
Exactly.
when I see that number.
Yeah, and this isn't necessarily a measurement that they'll continue listening every week, every month, however often they listen. This could just mean that they will maybe listen less frequently if the content stops coming out, like you said. Another effect the pandemic had on podcast listening is the location in which it occurs. Again, so for both last year's and this year's Latino podcast listener reports. They were conducted in May. So in May of 2020, at the height of COVID-19 restrictions in many states, 90% of monthly listeners said they ever listened to a podcast at home. That's down to 86% this year. And listening in locations outside the home, that's increased across the board: in the car, while walking around on foot, public transportation, at work, at the gym. All of those are up this year as things begin to open up again. And it's a similar story when we look at where listening occurs most. Since last year, at home listening here has shifted to each of these other places just about evenly. In a car, at work, and someplace else increase. But still, at home is where two-thirds of Latino monthly podcast listeners say they listen most. And because it's the dominant location, we want to take a look at what is going on in people's houses while they listen. So to do this, we isolate weekly listeners. We isolate the 85% of weekly listeners that say they listen at home. And the reason why we do that is because we're going to make a comparison. So we asked them, do you currently ever listen to podcasts while doing these activities? And the top two items to which people said yes are housework and chores and cooking and baking. So 3/4 said yes to both. Number three on this list, 69% said they ever listen while not doing anything else. So the primary focus there is just really on the podcast.
I love
And
that. Just got to give a shout out to those people who just listen to our work. Thank you so much.
yeah, especially at home too.
Yeah,
Um,
amazing. Amazing. I'm honored.
and those Duolingo podcasts are so captivating.
Yep,
Um,
yep, you know it. Good hosts.
and take a look at just how about half say they do so while spending time with family or friends. That 49%, that's more than double the rate when you compare that to the overall adult weekly podcast audience, not just Latinos, but also including Latinos. This data is from our podcast consumer tracking report. It's an online survey of the U.S. weekly podcast listening audience. And this right here shows quarter 4 to 2020 to quarter 1 2021 data. So not the best apples to apples comparisons to the Latino podcast listener report, but we still think it's important to show. Um, Look at the bottom item and how 22% say they listen while spending time with family or friends. That's once again less than half the size among Latinos who say that. The same in the previous page.
I love this data point for some reason. I personally, I have to be honest, I don't sit down and listen to podcasts with family or friends. I can't imagine a situation in which I'd like to do that. But the fact that my community, our community, Gabe, is more into that, it feeds into this little stereotype, that we're just like, we like to be with our people, we're very sociable. But also, I think it also points to something more practical, which is the kinds of content that they're consuming, right? Like, I don't know that I'd sit down and listen to an episode of Serial with like a group of people, my friends or family. But I think once we get into a little bit of that later in the presentation, I think it'll make a little more sense. And also just trends with the things we're finding in Enquestapod and also anecdotally. But it is a data point. I think I'm glad that you popped, you popped out because it's really curious and kind of charming.
Yeah, and it's also this idea, at least that I have in my gut, that Latinos, and I'm sure there's some data that supports this somewhere out there, Latinos are more likely to live in multi-generational households and with more
Of
people,
course.
right?
Yeah. And maybe even sharing a computer. And so, you're all in the living room. So might as well. Let's all listen to a podcast. I love it.
Ex-
I think it's wonderful. And I think it should be something we should take into account as creators, that co-listening is way more of a trend. And this is something I think about a lot more when it comes to kids, right? Like the trends now around listening to podcasts with kids. I wonder how likely Latino listeners are to listen with their kids. And I think that just that co-listening concept is bigger in this group.
hmm And yeah, we'll have to see if we have that data so we can plug that in there.
I
Um,
can't remember. I'm sorry.
yeah, not
Keeping it
necessarily on
suspenseful.
kids right now.
Right.
But I always have this theory that it's easier to listen to podcasts when you have something to look at, right? So let's zoom out
Oh.
of these weekly listeners and go back to our Latino Monthly Podcast listeners and see what I'm talking about here. The people that listen to podcasts with video and audio only, not without video, right? And here are some of the most common questions that we received last year after the report. If you remember, Martina, you pointed this out earlier. YouTube was the number one service last year. It still is this year. Um, and it was about podcasts and video. What percentage of Latinos listen to podcasts with video? So we asked Latinos about it, and 79% said they listen to podcasts with audio only and no video. 70% said they listen to podcasts with video that they actively watch while listening, and another 60% say video that is played in the background or minimized on their device. Note how that last item there, although it does include video, the behavior is primarily focused on just the audio.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we got into this because this was just such a surprising and shocking data point from last year that I think we really needed to dig into it, right? Like it was the first thing I asked myself. I was like, okay, you're saying that your number one platform for podcasts is YouTube. What are you looking at? And so I think this gives us a little more of an idea of how people are consuming podcasts on YouTube. And you know, these are pretty high numbers. I think I think it's worth considering that you know, video is not an insignificant contributing factor, right?
Hmm. Exactly. And some people like you are very surprised by this number, but we just have to put things into context. Take a look at those last two items. So those are podcasts with a video component, and 77%, so over three-quarters of U.S. Latinos listeners say they have ever listened to podcasts with a video component, but uh, just 8% say they listen exclusively to only podcasts with video that they actively watch while listening. So there's a ton of overlap. People who consume audio only podcasts are also listening to podcasts with video. And it's only that 8% that are listening only to video podcasts that they actively watch while listening. Does that make sense?
Yes. And actually, I think that I'm so glad you added this slide because at the end of the day, audio is still kind of, winning in this video experience, right? Can we say
Exactly.
that?
No, absolutely. And look, this is why we also asked preference, right? And we deliberately asked preference and not what type of podcast Latinos listen to most, because we wanted to capture Latinos' desires. We didn't want it to be a reflection of the content available. And while 41% say they prefer audio and video, while they actively watch it while listening, the majority still prefer that audio, uh, uh, the audio, right? 35% say they prefer audio only without any video, and 24% say they prefer audio and video, but where the audio is minimized on their device while they listen. So, like you said, audio still wins,
But just slightly,
just
right?
slightly in terms of
Just
preference.
just slightly. And so it is something to consider. I just think creators should really take note on this. Again, there are certain podcasts that are going to lend themselves to video components. Not all of them do, but even just having it on a video platform like YouTube without any video is still a significant number of people are going to tune into that. And so I think we're beyond the time where podcasters can ignore this element. I think it's something worth thinking about. Even if you discard it, know why and how and what you're doing at when you're discarding a video option.
Hmm. Exactly. And um, among those who listen to podcasts that have video, there are three types of videos people encounter. Roughly one third say video of the hosts recording their podcasts, and just under one half say video production related to the podcast topic. And about one third say video of a fixed image.
There you go. Exactly. You could just put a fixed image and you're still going to get 31% people that are going to want to watch it. I mean, I think that is just surprisingly high. Like many people have knocked down in, informal conversations, knocked down this idea of YouTube as a platform for podcasting. And there's a lot of reasons to knock it down in terms of usually monetizing, honestly. But the fact that people are turning to that platform for listening, we can no longer ignore. It's just something we're going to have to pay attention to.
It's almost as if YouTube has become somewhat of a go-to search engine for Latinos when it comes to media. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and maybe it won't be forever, but it's definitely where we're
mhm,
bringing people into podcasts. I'll say that at Adonde, we think about that as a breeding ground for future podcast listeners on podcast native apps. And so, how do you bring them over? You got to go to where they are. And this data is clearly showing they are there. They are where they are consuming videos, and they're kind of
Mm,
discovering this audio experience through the video platform and through the video watching experience. We just gonna have to accept that. That's just fact. Like, we can
mhm.
ignore them there, but this data is hopefully telling people that it's time to not to stop ignoring, I think.
Good point. You tell him, Martina. Um,
I'm
so
trying. I'm trying.
Martina's here to help everyone. Um,
Exactly. Only to help and inspire.
awesome. So switching topics, let's turn to podcasts that are hosted by Latinos. 62%, so more than the majority of Latino podcast listeners, report listening to a podcast hosted by a Latino within the last month, and 39% say within the last week. And there are various reasons as to why Latinos seek out other Latino content so frequently, many of which we covered in last year's report. But one item we want to highlight this year that we didn't last year is the desire to stay connected to heritage. And 38% listen to stay connected to their country of origin. And that could be Mexico, or territory of origin, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Colombia. It's whatever people indicated in the survey when they took it, right? And that might be a very niche reason, but I can personally relate, right? And when I reviewed this with a couple of our partners, I pointed this out, this story plenty of times, that the primary reason wasn't this. The primary reason for listening to a podcast was actually because of Edison. I'm unique because I work for a podcast research company, and so many other people do it for educational purposes, for other reasons. But this is the reason why I stayed. I started listening to Latino USA, and I listened to it and I was like, wow, this is what's missing on TV. This is what's missing on in movies, representation in these stories that I've never heard of before. The history of the Latino community in Atlanta, where to find the best food, different stories that Maria Hinojosa would talk about. And it's actually partly the reason why this report came into existence, because I thought this would serve my talents and the talents and expertise that Edison Research has in podcast listening to amplify these stories. So this is one of the reasons why I did it and one of the reasons why I stayed. So I can agree with this 38% of Latino monthly podcast listeners that this is the reason why I continue listening.
Yeah, I love that you shared that story, Gabe. I think it's pointing also to the value of producing stories outside of our national, fronteras. I think we should go into other countries, and obviously we at Adonde do that, and I think many other production companies are seeing the value of stories that are produced globally. And because our audience, our Latino audience, is an international one. It's one that's interested in staying connected, and it's a global one. And so I think this is just really heartening to see, and I hope that it'll drive some more ambitious reporting from outside of the United States.
Absolutely. And here's another reason to include Latinos in podcasts, and it has to do with ads. So Latinos have an affinity for brands advertised on podcasts hosted by other Latinos. The overwhelming majority of Latino monthly podcast listeners say they are at least somewhat likely to engage in each of these actions for the brands they hear on Latino podcasts.
Always good news. Always good news. Thank you. Our listeners are very loyal. And I think that that is something to consider, especially look at the question. I think that that's really key here, that they see that as support for Latino hosted podcasts. And so I think that that's something that, I hope the industry takes seriously.
Good point. Good point there. Um, and if advertising isn't the way you want to monetize your podcast, then you can think of premiums that you can offer to listeners. Over half of Latino monthly listeners are at least somewhat likely to pay a small monthly fee in order to avoid hearing ads on the podcast they listen to. And I personally have never seen these numbers this high when it comes to this question for any group of podcast listeners in our other research.
Yeah, I'm sure this correlates with age in some way, right? Gabe, do we have that handy? Because I really wonder about the likelihood of people to pay based on their age and being a younger group. I think Latinos are also just also more digitally native. They're getting to a point where they're paying for services and for media and in other ways, like Netflix or Spotify. And so I wonder if that's part of the driving force here.
Yes, and this is what it looks like by age, right? You can see that those between ages 18 to 34, they're more likely to say yes to this question. They're more likely to pay that small monthly fee. Uh, the higher rate, though, is among those who are between ages 35 and 54. So you make a really good point there. The lower rate is among those who are 55 plus. And that does really correlate with age, like you mentioned. If we go back a little bit though and kind of rewind, we also want to give the estimate for this market by taking those who say that they're very likely to pay a small monthly fee, and that's 33%, which equates to our estimate 6 million Latinos. Okay, so Martina, we can't have Latino Report if we don't look at podcast listening in English and Spanish and how they compare.
Of course not.
Mhm. And this year, 89% of Latino monthly listeners say they've ever listened to a podcast in English. That's up 5 points since last year. That's increased across all groups here, besides the third generation, as you can see on the bottom. Um, And now over a third say they've ever listened to a podcast that was mostly in Spanish, which is up 4 points since last year. Now, in this case, listening among the third generation Latinos did increase quite a bit.
I will say that this is really interesting to me because US born third generation, and we were talking about a person who was born in the US, their parents were born in the US, and their grandparents, and they are growing in their interest in Spanish language podcasting. I just find that fascinating. This is a group we cannot ignore. I think that it ties into something we touched on in last year's report about wanting to stay connected to the language, and then here in one of the data points we've included this year about wanting to stay connected to your country of origin. I'm really, really compelled by that third generation US born listener who is, tuning in to Spanish podcasts. I find that to be really encouraging for anyone who's producing podcasts in Spanish.
Yep. And it's a group, that they're willing to try out these Spanish podcasts this year. So it means that they're more likely to try it out. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're listening every month though, and that rate is a bit lower. Um, 57% say they consumed a Spanish podcast in the last month, and that's up from a little under half at 49% last year. And 81% of monthly listeners say they listened to an English podcast in the last month, and that's up from 73% last year. So while it's good news that this rate is increasing, just keep in mind what we've mentioned already in the past. Everyone should start thinking of ways to prevent new listeners from dropping off.
Got to make that good content. That's what it's all about.
Mhm. And here's when they started listening to each. The differences are clear here. A larger percentage of Latinos who listen in Spanish began listening in Spanish more recently than English listeners to English podcasts. And this reinforces our earlier point that Spanish language content is becoming more available and platforms are doing a better job of getting that content in front of listeners. But there's an added complexity to all of this. It's never a dichotomy. Spanish and English aren't always mutually exclusive, especially not here in the Estados Unidos. So this year, we decided to measure listening to bilingual podcasts, and the outcome, just under 3/4 of Latinos who are monthly listeners currently listen to a podcast mixed with both English and Spanish.
Boom. This is quite a data point, my friend. I love this. I think this is so fascinating. It's making my head spin with more questions. Like, I just am like, how much English? How much Spanish? I'm just so happy that this was asked.
Yes, and this is just scratching the surface. And we did also ask another question. We asked, once again, preference. Not
Oh,
what you
yes.
listen to most, not what you listen to most, because we want it to be a reflection of what people want, not what content is available. How do you prefer to listen to a podcast? And that 41% demonstrates preference for podcasts with a mix of both Spanish and English, while the two other groups who said entirely in Spanish and entirely in English, they're at similar rates, and that's 26%. It's for Spanish, 29% for English.
This is to me the key to the whole thing. I mean, I think what we're seeing, there's a story being told, right, by all this data. And I think that the story is really showing an intergenerational approach to consuming storytelling and entertainment through audio. It's coming through video, the through like places where you don't even know that you're listening to a podcast. You're growing through during a pandemic, and maybe because you're listening with friends and family. But this point of mixing with both English and Spanish, that 41% is really to me showing the diversity that we're dealing with in the Latino population and Latino monthly listeners, and that we are a bilingual community and we live in English and Spanish. And it makes sense that these realities that we may be living in these multi-generational homes, that we might be doing, maybe discovering podcasts through our video consumption, right? Like, it's just reflecting the life of the average Latino in the US. And it's just I love the diversity of it, but it's also telling a very cohesive story about a community that lives in two languages, that's still coming out and discovering new media. And it's growing. I don't know. What do you think, Gabe? What are your main takeaways from
Yeah.
this year's Latino Podcast Listener report?
Well, that was very well put, and you
Oh, thank you.
covered the entire report really, really well. And for me, I wanted to point out that the fact that there was potential last year, we emphasized that hard. And you, Martina, and everyone listening here, you guys capitalized. Latinos adopted podcasts like No Tomorrow last year. Like I said, there was plenty of upside. But I didn't think listening would explode in a matter of just 1 year. We've seen gaps in listening with the total population nearly close as Latino monthly listenership truly soared. And it just, it didn't take a pandemic, but it took everyone a part of this beautiful community, creators, marketers, platforms, and everyone in the industry. You all labored, and here are your fruits. I'm just happy we really got to measure them, and we'll continue doing so. The ceiling is still pretty high.
Love it.
So Martina, this is our time. Thank you for your priceless insights. It's been real.
Thank you. It's been real honored to present this data and to be a part of this group of amazing sponsors who came together to fund this. I just need to give them another shout out because this does not happen overnight. It doesn't happen without a lot of effort and a lot of resources that are pulled together. I think that's the real beauty in this is that we really did bring together a bunch of people and different organizations to say we care about this data being out there and about this community being represented in the podcast industry. So that is a true honor, and I am grateful to all of the partners who had me represent them and this study today with you, Gabe.
Absolutely. A big thank you to our partners, like you said, Martina, your company, Adonde Media. Big thank you to Lantigua Williams and Company, Libsyn, PRX, Simplecast, Sonoro, and SXM Media. To all viewers, thank you so much for joining us. A recording of this webinar and a copy of the full report that'll be available on edisonresearch.com immediately after we're finished here. And thank you very much to my colleagues, my amazing colleagues back at Edison Research. I may have been the messenger of all of this data, but there were many hardworking people that made this report possible. We'll see you guys next time.